I've always believed that a man's worth isn't measured by what he owns, but by what he can still fix with his own hands. For most of my 76 years, that belief kept me upright when everything else seemed to lean sideways. I built bridges and schools, laid foundations that are probably still standing across 3 counties. I raised a son who used to follow me around the backyard with a plastic hammer, pretending to build beside me. I thought I'd done everything right, paid off my mortgage, stayed faithful to my late wife through all the hospital years, and kept a little dignity tucked in the pocket of every worn-out flannel shirt. But dignity doesn't stretch as far as it used to. These days, it barely covers a man's loneliness. After my wife, Margaret, passed, the house became too large for me. Every sound echoed. The clinking of a spoon, the ticking of the clock. They all reminded me she wasn't there to fill the space anymore. My son, Daniel, told me it wasn't safe for me to live alone. He and his wife, Erica, said I'd be happier, closer to family. The phrase sounded kind enough at the time, though now it feels like one of those polite lies people tell when they've already made up their minds. I sold my house, against my own quiet instincts, and invested a good part of that money into Daniel's contracting business. A gesture of faith, a father's way of saying, I believe in you. He promised me a room in their home, a place where I could retire with peace. Peace, however, doesn't dwell where you aren't wanted. It slips away, hides in corners, and sometimes you stop noticing it's gone. At first, living with them wasn't unbearable. I tried to stay out of the way. I'd rise early before anyone else was awake, to make coffee, fix the leaky faucet, replace the worn hinges on the kitchen cabinets, and then sit quietly at the end of the dining table as the sun crept through the window blinds. Erica never liked how I left my cup on the counter. She said it made the kitchen look cluttered. I started rinsing it right away, drying it, putting it back in the cupboard. Little things, but they added up. Small corrections that told me, in 1,000 wordless ways, that I no longer belonged entirely to my own habits. Even my footsteps seemed too heavy for their house. The floors creaked under me like a guilty conscience. The grandchildren were kind in the beginning, or maybe they were just curious. They'd come up to my room, ask about the old photographs I kept on the dresser. I told them stories about their grandmother, about the time we got snowed in near Lake George and had to burn furniture to stay warm. They'd laugh, wide-eyed and innocent, before Erica called them downstairs, saying they had homework, piano, screen time limits. Slowly, their visits stopped. I'd hear them in the living room sometimes, their laughter mingling with the sound of the television, and I'd sit on my bed, holding one of those photos like a relic from another life. You learn not to call for people who no longer listen. When Thanksgiving drew near, I felt a strange flicker of hope. Holidays used to mean something. Margaret would bake her pecan pie. Daniel would bring his school friends. The house would smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon, and laughter would fill every corner. I even pulled my old corduroy jacket from the closet, brushed it, planned to help set the table like I always did. But modern Thanksgiving, as I've come to learn, isn't about gratitude. It's about presentation. Erica started talking about image, about how the house had to look perfect because they were hosting special guests. She said they were business partners of Daniel's, potential investors, very particular people. Her words carried a brittle sweetness that cracked at the edges. "Dad," Daniel told me one night, "maybe just for this year, you could keep a low profile. Erica's nervous about the impression we make." I laughed, not mockingly, but in disbelief. A low profile? In my own son's house? I asked him what exactly he meant. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes, and said something vague about space being tight. Too many people, logistics, the kind of talk that sounds practical until you realize it's hiding something unkind. I started noticing how they spoke about me when they thought I couldn't hear. Erica complained on the phone to her sister that it's hard to make the house feel elegant with a smell of old books and ointment in the air. I knew she meant me. Daniel said nothing to defend me, only muttered, "He's just old-fashioned. Give him time." The word stung worse than if he'd joined her insult, because in silence, a man reveals where his loyalties truly lie. The week before Thanksgiving, I tried to make myself useful. I repaired the back porch railing, rewired a faulty socket in the hallway, even polished the brass handles on the staircase. Erica barely noticed. She was too busy arranging centerpieces and rehearsing how the house should look to strangers. I overheard her telling the cleaning lady not to touch the upstairs storage area, my room. That's what she called it now. Storage. It was as if I'd already been reclassified into the category of things that should be out of sight. One evening, I found Daniel in the garage, polishing his truck. I tried to talk to him, to ask if everything was all right between us, if I'd done something to make things awkward. He smiled, that tired, distracted smile men use when they want to end a conversation before it begins, and said, "Dad, you're overthinking. We're just trying to make sure everything goes smoothly." He patted my shoulder and left me standing there, staring at the cement floor, wondering when the word "we" had stopped, including me. Nights grew colder as November settled in. I'd sit by the small window in my room, watching the maple tree in the yard lose its last leaves. The wind carried that sharp, clean smell of winter, the kind that used to make me feel alive. Now it just made me feel unnecessary. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, I'd whisper to Margaret as if she were still beside me. "They mean well," I'd say. "They're just busy." But even my own voice didn't sound convinced anymore. It's strange how people can make you feel invisible without ever raising their voices. How exclusion can be polite, even gentle. I began to sense the unspoken truth that my presence, once a symbol of family and legacy, had become an inconvenience, something to be managed. The night before Thanksgiving, Erica knocked on my door. She wore that fixed smile she reserves for when she's about to ask something she knows she shouldn't. "Robert," she said, "she never calls me Dad. We have so many people coming tomorrow, and the house will be a bit crowded. We were thinking maybe you could stay up in the attic for the day. It's temporary, just so things look coordinated." Her voice softened on that last word, like she believed her politeness made it better. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but none came. "You mean up there?" I asked, pointing at the narrow ceiling hatch. She nodded quickly. "We'll make it comfortable. Blankets, a lamp, maybe even your little radio. It's just, the guests can be sensitive, and we want them to feel modern." I almost laughed again, but my throat tightened. Modern. That's what I'd become incompatible with. I realized in that moment that the man who once built homes for others no longer had a rightful place in one. After she left, I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. My hands trembled slightly, though from what? Anger, disbelief, humiliation, I couldn't tell. Through the wall, I heard the muffled sound of my son's voice, low and compliant. He didn't object. He never did. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, and the ache in my chest grew heavy, dull, familiar. I tried to tell myself it was only for a day, that I was overreacting, that this was the kind of compromise older men make when the world around them moves faster than they can follow. But deep inside, I knew something had shifted irreversibly. Respect, once cracked, doesn't mend like wood. It splinters and never quite fits again. I went to bed that night unable to sleep, the house breathing around me like a stranger. The moonlight through the blinds traced thin bars across the carpet, and I thought of cages, quiet ones, made not of iron, but of shame. I thought of Margaret's voice saying, "Don't let them shrink you, Robert." I promised her once that I would never let anyone make me small. But tomorrow is Thanksgiving, and my family had already prepared a place for me. Not at the table, not in the living room, but above it all, out of sight, where the dust settles and the light rarely reaches. And that's where my story truly begins. Thanksgiving morning began with the smell of roasted butter and cloves drifting up the staircase, the kind of scent that used to pull me straight into the kitchen when Margaret was alive. For a moment I almost forgot where I was and what kind of day it would be. Old memories are cruel that way. They trick you into thinking the world hasn't changed until you step into it again and see how foreign it's become. I was halfway through buttoning my shirt when I heard Erica's voice calling from below, bright and managerial, the way one speaks to delivery drivers. "Robert, could you come up here for a second? We're getting things ready for you." I hesitated. "Up here," that was her phrase. Not downstairs with everyone else, but up here, to the attic. Daniel appeared a few minutes later, holding a folded blanket under one arm and a flashlight under the other. He avoided looking directly at me, speaking as though reciting instructions someone else had given him. "Dad, I've cleared a nice space in the attic. We moved some boxes. There's room for the cot. It'll just be for the afternoon, maybe the evening. You'll have some quiet time, and when the dinner's over, you can come down." He said it quickly, as though speed might soften the meaning. I wanted to ask why I couldn't stay in my own room, but the words died before leaving my mouth. I knew the answer already. They wanted their guests to see a picture of success, a polished family without loose threads or awkward reminders of mortality sitting in the corner. In that picture, I simply didn't fit. The attic hatch opened with a dry creak, and a gust of cold air slipped down the hallway. I looked up into the square of dim light, thinking how many years had passed since I'd last climbed that ladder. Dust motes hung like faint stars in the beam of Daniel's flashlight. He went first, setting down the blanket, then reached his hand toward me. I took it, not because I needed help climbing, but because it was the last small gesture left between us that still resembled tenderness. My knees ached as I stepped onto the wooden planks, each one bending slightly under my weight. The air smelled of insulation and forgotten Christmas decorations. They had made a kind of corner for me, a narrow cot pushed against a beam, a small table with a lamp, my radio, and a thermos of coffee. It wasn't cruel in appearance, not overtly. It was the politeness of exile. "We'll check on you later," Daniel said, forcing a smile. "There's a space heater somewhere. I'll bring it up when I find it." He climbed down before I could reply. I heard the hatch close, then the sharp click of a latch. It wasn't locked, not at first. But an hour later, when I tried to push it open, it wouldn't budge. Maybe it had swollen from the cold. Maybe not. Below me, the sounds of life swelled and blurred. Laughter, dishes clattering, music. Through the thin boards I could hear the rhythm of voices I once knew so well, but which now seemed to belong to another species altogether. Erica's tone was bright and sharp, slicing through conversations. "Everything's organic, farm-sourced." "Oh, that? It's Daniel's father's old collection. We keep it stored upstairs." I caught my breath. Stored. That word again, used so casually, like I was a piece of furniture they hadn't decided to throw out yet. I sat back on the cot, the blanket rough against my palms, and felt a wave of nausea roll through me. I tried to laugh, to shake it off, but it came out as a sound closer to a cough. The attic light flickered, struggling with the old wiring. I reached to adjust the bulb, and the metal base sparked. It startled me, though it shouldn't have. I'd rewired enough old houses to know what shoddy maintenance looked like. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who'd built safe homes for others now sat in the most unsafe corner of his own family's. I turned off the lamp and sat in the semi's darkness, the only light coming from a thin seam between the floorboards where daylight leaked through like a secret. I tried listening to the radio, but all I could find were static and faint sermons about gratitude. At some point, Erica climbed halfway up the ladder and shouted, "Robert, are you warm enough? We'll bring you a plate later. We're just getting settled." Her voice was cheerful but distant, like someone shouting to a neighbor across a fence. I told her I was fine. The hatch closed again. I waited. I don't know how long. Time in a place without clocks moves differently, like a slow drip of cold water. The attic began to cool. The air grew still. I could hear wind rattling the vents, and once, faintly, a child's laugh. One of my grandchildren, though I couldn't tell which. I tried calling out to them, but the music downstairs swallowed my voice whole. Hours passed. My coffee went cold. I wrapped the blanket tighter around me, shifting to keep my legs from stiffening. My thoughts wandered to Margaret, to the bridge project I supervised in '82, to the feeling of belonging somewhere useful. I realized I hadn't been touched, truly touched, in months. People brushed past me, handed me things, maybe patted my shoulder, but there was no human weight in it, no connection. Up there, surrounded by boxes labeled holiday decor, I understood how loneliness becomes physical, how it crawls into your bones and makes them ache. At one point, I heard a clinking of glasses and the start of applause. Someone made a toast. Daniel's voice carried upward, muffled, but distinct enough. To family, to gratitude, to everything we've built together. There was laughter, cheers, a cork popping. I sat there listening, the words looping in my mind. Everything we've built together. I wanted to shout that he hadn't built this alone, that I'd poured my life into the very foundation beneath their feet, that even the down payment on this house had come from selling my own. But the truth wouldn't have reached them. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet or walls anymore. It was something deeper, a kind of moral gap that no ladder could bridge. I must have dozed off because I woke to the sound of something scraping, a branch against the roof, maybe, or a mouse in the insulation. The lamp had burned out. The air was sharper now, the kind that bites your skin when you breathe too deeply. I tried the hatch again, pressing my shoulder against it, still stuck. I called out softly, then louder. No answer. For a moment I imagined the absurd, the house catching fire, everyone escaping while I pounded on the trap door, choking on smoke. I'd drawn those very escape diagrams hundreds of times in my career. 2 exits minimum per floor, I used to write in red pencil, but up here there was only one, and it was sealed. I laughed quietly, bitterly, the sound small and hollow. Below, the party rolled on. I could hear silverware scraping plates, the low hum of conversation, the polite laughter of guests pretending to be charmed. My stomach growled. No one had brought me food. I tried not to care. Pride has a strange way of feeding itself when the body can't. I sat with my back against a beam, listening to the sound of my own breath. Somewhere between one song and another, I thought I heard Daniel's voice rise, irritated, maybe arguing with Erica. A door slammed. Then silence. Only after several minutes did the noise resume. but softer, more cautious. I imagined him defending me. Probably not loudly, but enough to ease his conscience. Maybe he said something like, "We should check on Dad later." Or maybe he said nothing at all. The night crept in gradually. The attic darkened until it felt almost subterranean. I could no longer see the boxes, only sense their outlines. The floorboards groaned when I moved, as if disapproving of the disturbance. I tried to remember how I had ended up there, step by step, decision by decision. Every moment I'd chosen silence over confrontation. Every time I'd excused their distance as modern life. It came to me with painful clarity that I hadn't been forced into that attic in a single day. I'd been climbing toward it for years, one small compromise at a time. Sometime after midnight, the house went quiet. The laughter, the clinking, the music, all gone. I thought I heard the faint sound of a lock turning below. I didn't check. There was nothing left to check. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, listened to the wind slip through the gaps in the roof, and told myself it would be morning soon, that I would get up, push open that hatch, and pretend none of this had happened. But as I drifted between waking and sleep, I knew something irreversible had begun. A boundary had been crossed, not just theirs, but mine. And though I didn't yet know it, before that week was over, the house that had hidden me away would soon face its own reckoning. When I woke, it was still dark, and for a few seconds I couldn't remember where I was. The air in the attic felt different, heavier, colder, filled with the faint metallic smell of dust and wires. My back ached from the narrow cot, my throat was dry, and the silence around me had the strange, swollen quality that follows after a storm. I could hear the house breathing beneath me, the low hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the water heater, a pipe shuddering somewhere inside the walls. Then I heard footsteps, quick, purposeful, followed by the faint clatter of plates being moved. Someone was cleaning. I lay still, listening. It was probably Erica, tidying up after the party, ensuring the house looked pristine before morning, because image was always her form of devotion. The hatch above the ladder was still shut tight. I pressed against it, testing it gently, but it didn't give. My shoulder met resistance, firm, not accidental. They had sealed it. Perhaps she'd turned the latch for safety, or perhaps they just didn't want to risk anyone seeing me if a guest came by early. Whatever the reason, I was alone. The thought didn't strike like a sharp blade. It was duller, slower, the way frost kills a plant overnight. Quietly, without spectacle. I sat back down, rubbing my knees, and waited for the light to change. As dawn crept in through the cracks between the boards, thin lines of gold stretched across the floor like threads. Dust drifted lazily in the beams, turning the air almost tangible. I tried to find comfort in the routine of small tasks, folding the blanket, adjusting the lamp, tapping the radio dial, but the static filled the room with an unease I couldn't shake. I thought of calling out, yet something in me resisted. Pride? Fear of confirming what I already knew, that no one would answer. Time moved unevenly. I watched the sun climb, fade, return again in the same colorless rhythm. Once or twice I heard the faint sound of a car starting, doors closing, laughter. I imagined Daniel and Erica waving their guests goodbye, shaking hands at the front door, thanking them for a perfect evening. Maybe someone complimented the house. Maybe Erica accepted it as her personal triumph, never mentioning that an old man had been sitting above them like a ghost all night. I wondered if Daniel thought of me at all, or if he believed his compliance had been an act of mercy, protecting me from embarrassment, as he would later claim. Around noon, the cold deepened. I noticed condensation on the window frame, little beads forming and freezing into a thin sheet of frost. My breath came out in faint clouds. The space heater Daniel had promised never appeared. My hands trembled, partly from chill, partly from the dull throb of anger that had begun to rise, slow and steady like the ticking of a hidden clock. Anger wasn't a familiar companion to me anymore. I'd learned to swallow it over the years, to disguise it as patience. But there, in that cramped attic, surrounded by the silence of a family that had turned its face away, I began to feel the old pulse of defiance that had once carried me through the hardest winters of my youth. The hours dragged. I tried to distract myself by recalling the structure of the attic, the joists, the spacing, the load-bearing beams. It was a habit I'd never lost, measuring, assessing, understanding the skeleton of a place. I realized then how fragile the whole setup was. The wiring was decades old, patched together carelessly. The insulation yellowed and frayed. Nails stuck out of the boards at sharp angles, and one section of the flooring sagged dangerously, where boxes were stacked. A single spark, a misplaced candle, and the place could go up in flames before anyone downstairs even smelled smoke. The thought wasn't abstract. It was terrifyingly real. I sat there staring at the dim bulb and wondered whether anyone in that house besides me had ever noticed how unsafe it truly was. The noise downstairs grew faint, then vanished altogether. I climbed off the cot, stretching my back, and went to the small window under the eaves. From there, I could see a thin slice of the street, the tops of parked cars, the distant shimmer of frost on the asphalt, and across the road, a neighbor hanging a wreath on her porch. For a moment, I envied her simple solitude. The world outside seemed orderly, oblivious to the quiet humiliation unfolding just a few yards away. I pressed my hand against the glass. It was icy. My reflection looked back at me, pale, lined, unfamiliar. The face of a man who had given his family everything and been hidden away like a relic. When the doorbell rang below, I jumped. Voices followed, cheerful, animated. More guests? Another dinner? I couldn't tell. I moved closer to the floorboards and listened, my ear near the seam. The voices were muffled, but I caught fragments. Investors, expansion, permit. My chest tightened. They were talking business again. My money, my years of work, had become part of a machine that now excluded me entirely. I heard Daniel's voice rising in that rehearsed confidence he always used when pretending to be more successful than he was. Erica's laughter followed, the brittle kind, all surface. I pressed my palm against the wood, not out of anger this time, but disbelief. They were down there building futures while I sat above them, a reminder of everything they wanted to erase. After a while, the conversation drifted away. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, my stomach cramped from hunger. I reached for the thermos. The coffee inside was long gone cold. When I tried to stand, my leg cramped, sending a shock up my thigh. I steadied myself against the beam and waited for it to pass. My body, like the rest of me, had grown tired of waiting. I realized then how dependent I was, not just physically, but in every possible way. I had no keys, no phone signal, no way to leave without help. They had taken my independence, repackaged it as care, and sold it back to me as safety. Toward evening, the wind rose. The old roof groaned, and something loose, a shingle perhaps, clattered down the side. The sound made me flinch. I wrapped the blanket tighter, but the cold kept seeping in, creeping up my legs like water. My breath rasped. Every inhalation hurt a little more than the last. I thought about knocking, shouting, demanding to be let out. But what then? Would they open the hatch with faces full of guilt? Would they pretend it had been a misunderstanding? I didn't want their apologies. I wanted acknowledgement, and that was something no key could unlock. As the night deepened, the light bulb flickered again, casting long, jerking shadows on the rafters. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the wood startled me awake. My imagination started conjuring things. The faint smell of burning dust, a hiss from the wiring, the ghost of Margaret's voice whispering, "You shouldn't have trusted them so blindly." I whispered back, "I know," though my lips barely moved. I could almost see her sitting beside me, wrapped in her old shawl, shaking her head, not in anger, but in that quiet sadness she used to reserve for when Daniel got into trouble as a boy. At some point, exhaustion gave in. I must have slept, though it was a restless, fractured kind of sleep. Dreams of ladders without ends, of narrow spaces closing in, of fire climbing silently up the walls. When I woke, my hands were numb, my chest tight. The lamp had gone out completely. I fumbled for the flashlight Daniel had left me, but its batteries had died. For a long time I sat there in the dark, listening to my own breathing and wondering whether anyone below even remembered I was there. The sound that finally broke the silence wasn't a voice, but the shrill beep of a smoke detector from somewhere downstairs. One short chirp, then nothing. My heart jumped, though I knew it was probably just a dying battery. Still, the irony of it made me laugh, softly at first, then harder, until the laugh turned into a cough. Here I was, a retired engineer who'd spent half his life designing fire safety protocols, sitting in a wooden attic with no ventilation, no exits, and wiring that could ignite at any moment. I tried to steady my breathing, but the absurdity of it all pressed down on me like a physical weight. When morning came again, gray and thin, I heard Daniel's voice at last. He was arguing with Erica near the base of the ladder. "It's freezing up there," he said. "We should let him down." Her reply came sharp, quick. "Not now, Dan. The kids are having breakfast. It'll confuse them." Silence followed. Then footsteps walking away. The hatch never opened. I leaned my forehead against the cold wood and closed my eyes. In that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not despair, but a deep, steady clarity. I understood then that what was happening wasn't an accident of circumstance, but a choice. They had chosen comfort over decency, appearance over kinship. I sat back down on the cot, my breath fogging in front of me. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel the full weight of anger without apology. It wasn't the wild kind that burns out fast. It was the quiet, deliberate kind that settles deep, finds purpose. My hands, though trembling, reached for the small notebook I kept in my jacket pocket, the one where I used to jot down measurements and safety notes. I opened it, found a blank page, and began to write. Not a letter of forgiveness, not a plea. Just facts, violations, code numbers, dates. I wrote until my fingers cramped. By the time I stopped, the first spark of an idea, something cold, methodical, and just, had taken root. The attic that had been my prison would become their reckoning. And that was how the long night of humiliation ended. Not with pity, but with purpose. I don't know exactly when exhaustion crossed into delirium. It must have been the second night, or maybe the morning of the third. Time had lost its edges. The attic light hadn't come back on, and the flashlight lay dead beside me like some useless relic of intention. I could see almost nothing except the faint gleam of frost gathering along the window frame. The air burned when I breathed, sharp enough to make my chest tighten. I had wrapped the blanket twice around myself, but the cold had found its way through, creeping up my spine and into my fingers. It was the kind of cold that doesn't just chill the body, it drains the will. It makes you start to think about closing your eyes for a minute, maybe two, and letting the ache fade out quietly. I remember sitting upright and feeling my heartbeat slow. My throat was so dry it hurt to swallow. There was still no sound from below, no voices, no footsteps, just the occasional hum of the furnace that seemed to reach every part of the house except the attic. I called out once weakly, just to test whether my voice still worked. "Daniel?" It came out as a rasp, not even loud enough to carry through the floorboards. I waited, but there was nothing, only silence answering back. Somewhere in that stillness, the shape of a thought began to form, the kind that starts small, like a whisper at the back of the mind, then sharpens until it becomes impossible to ignore. I realized they might not even know I was still up there. Maybe they'd gone away for the weekend. Maybe they'd simply forgotten. The idea sounded too cruel to be true, but so did everything else that week. When I tried to stand, my legs buckled. The dizziness came fast, a rush of black around the edges of my vision. I reached for the beam to steady myself, but the room tilted. My hand slipped, and for a second I thought I was falling through the floor. I hit the boards hard enough to knock the breath out of me. A loud thump echoed below, a noise that should have brought someone running. No one came. I lay there staring up at the rafters, the edges of them blurring together, dust swirling in the faint light. My chest heaved in shallow bursts. I thought, absurdly, of Margaret's laughter, the way she used to scold me for overexerting myself, telling me that old bones needed rest. I wanted to tell her she'd been right. I don't know how long I stayed on the floor. My body had gone half numb. I felt the vibration of footsteps only once, and they faded quickly. The attic began to close in, its narrow angles folding around me like a coffin. I tried to crawl toward the hatch, dragging myself by the edge of the cot, but each movement set off another wave of nausea. I stopped, breathing shallowly, afraid that if I passed out completely, I might never wake up. The air felt thin, maybe because the vent up here hadn't worked in years. I remembered fixing it once, long before they bought the house. I'd told Daniel back then that it needed a full replacement, that attics without proper ventilation could become death traps. He'd nodded distractedly, saying he'd get to it later. Later, I murmured now, my voice slurring around the word. Later had finally come. Somewhere in the haze, I started to dream with my eyes open. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, rearranging themselves into shapes. A ladder, a bridge, a woman's silhouette turning away. I thought I saw Margaret again, standing near the window, her hair lit by a pale light that couldn't possibly exist in this room. She looked disappointed, though not in them, in me. "You let them," she said softly. Her voice wasn't cruel, just tired. "You let them shrink you until you fit inside their excuses." I tried to answer, but my mouth wouldn't move. She came closer, touched my shoulder, and for a moment I felt warm again. Then she was gone, and the warmth went with her. The next thing I remember clearly is waking to a blinding brightness. The hatch above me had been opened a crack, just enough for sunlight to pour through. I blinked, disoriented, then realized the light wasn't natural. It was from the bulb, flickering weakly back to life. I heard voices below, faint but unmistakable. Daniel and Erica were arguing. The words floated up through the floor in fragments. "I told you he'd be fine. You can't just ignore him. He's overreacting." I tried to call out, but my voice came out broken, a dry whisper. I pushed at the hatch. It moved half an inch before stopping again. There was something heavy on top of it. Maybe a box, maybe intentional. I slammed my palm against it, once, twice. "Daniel!" My throat tore with the effort. The noise below stopped for a second, then resumed, softer this time, like two people whispering who didn't want to be heard. The sunlight faded, replaced by the dim amber of late afternoon. I felt weaker than I'd ever felt in my life. My hands shook uncontrollably, and when I looked down, my skin had taken on that dull, paper-gray hue of cold. I thought about lying back down, closing my eyes just for a little while, but something stubborn kept me upright. I crawled again toward the window and tried to open it, but the frame had been painted shut. My reflection in the glass startled me. A hollow-eyed stranger looking back, mouth slightly open as if searching for air. I pressed my forehead to the glass, the chill biting into my skin, and I thought, if I die here, no one will even know until the smell reaches them. The thought wasn't bitter. It was simply a fact. Then, through the fog in my head, I heard it. A faint crackling sound, electric and wrong. The bulb above me flared once, twice, and a puff of smoke rose from its base. Instinct kicked in before reason. I tore the cord from the socket, coughing as the smell of burnt dust filled the air. My pulse raced. That small sound had snapped something awake inside me, the part of me that still remembered every fire code, every safety regulation, every inspection checklist I'd ever written. The attic was a hazard. Faulty wiring, blocked exit, no smoke alarm, flammable insulation. It was a coffin disguised as storage. And if that bulb had done more than flicker, if a real spark had caught, I wouldn't have stood a chance. The realization hit with an almost physical clarity. I wasn't just neglected. I was in danger. Real, measurable, documented danger. The kind of danger people get fined and sued for. The humiliation, the cold, the hunger. They had all blurred together until this moment. But now everything sharpened into a single line of thought, crisp and unshakable. They had built their little kingdom on lies and negligence, and they had hidden me in the one place where those lies could burn them down. I found the strength to stand again, leaning heavily on the beam. My breathing steadied. My hands stopped trembling. It wasn't forgiveness I felt. It was focus. Cold, deliberate focus. I moved slowly, testing each step, until I reached the hatch again. I pressed against it with both palms. It didn't move. Fine. I went back to the cot, found the metal rod from the broken lamp, and used it to wedge into the gap. After a few tries, the latch gave way with a snap. The hatch lifted an inch, then two, and icy air rushed in. The noise must have carried, because I heard a door slam below. Hurried footsteps, Erica's voice sharp with alarm. "Robert, what are you doing?" What was I doing? Something I should have done long ago. I didn't answer. I lowered myself carefully down the ladder, my knees screaming, my hands white-knuckled on the rungs. When my feet touched the hallway floor, the warmth hit me like a wave. The lights were on. The smell of disinfectant in the air. They'd cleaned up, erased all traces of the feast. Erica stood a few feet away, pale and rigid. Daniel appeared behind her, his face frozen between guilt and irritation. "Dad," he started, but I raised my hand to stop him. My voice came out hoarse, low but steady. "You locked me up there." He opened his mouth, searching for words that wouldn't make him sound as cruel as he'd been. "It wasn't—" I didn't let him finish. "You locked me up there," I repeated. "No heat, no alarm, faulty wiring, one exit blocked." My old professional tone returned, automatic, clinical. "That's a Class C violation under County Fire Code." Erica flinched as if struck. Daniel tried to laugh, a short, desperate sound. "Dad, come on, don't start with that inspector talk again. Do you realize what would have happened if that light caught?" I said. You wouldn't have just hidden your shame. You would have killed it." He stared at me, eyes darting toward the floor. I could see the child he used to be, scared, caught lying, unable to meet my gaze. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. Then the anger returned, not wild, but surgical, precise. "You want to live like this? Fine, but you'll do it by the book." I turned toward the front door. Erica called after me, her voice rising. "Where are you going?" "To make a call," I said without turning. Outside, the air was biting, but clean. The sun hung low over the neighborhood, pale and indifferent. I walked to the curb slowly, each step stiff but certain. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. The signal was weak, but alive. My fingers hovered over the screen for a moment. I could have called Daniel's bluff again, threatened him, made him promise change. But I'd done that all my life, reasoned, softened, compromised. This time I dialed the fire marshal's number directly. When the dispatcher answered, I introduced myself in the same calm tone I used to use in my reports. "My name is Robert Delaney," I said. "I need to report a property that fails multiple safety codes: wiring, egress, heating, structural." I gave the address, my voice steady even as my knees trembled from exhaustion. The woman on the line asked if there was immediate danger. I looked back at the house, its lights glowing warmly through the windows, the picture of suburban order. "Yes," I said after a long pause. "Immediate and moral." I hung up and stood there for a while, letting the cold seep into me, feeling more awake than I had in years. The sky above the rooftops was turning the color of steel, the kind of gray that promises snow. Inside that house, I knew, Erica would be pacing. Daniel would be calling my name, maybe even pretending concern. But for once, their noise couldn't reach me. The air around me was open, limitless. I was out of the attic. And the man they had locked up there was never going back. The morning after the call felt different, almost unnaturally clear, as if the air itself had been scrubbed clean of its usual weight. The sun was sharp, the street quiet, and the frost on the hedges sparkled with that cruel precision that winter sometimes uses to remind you what's real. When I saw the county vehicle pull up, not a fire engine, but a gray SUV with amber lights turning lazily, I didn't feel triumph. I felt balance, maybe for the first time in years. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Inspector Farley, tall, thin, late 50s, carrying the calm gravity of someone who's seen too many burned-out basements to be impressed by suburban charm. His partner, Lopez, younger, focused, was already pulling a tablet from her bag, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. Erica came out of the house before they reached the steps. She moved quickly in that clipped, hostess-like way she had when she wanted to control a situation before it became one. "This must be a misunderstanding," she said, with that brittle smile meant for church committees and HOA meetings. "We've just been remodeling. There was a bit of family tension, but—" Farley raised a hand, polite but firm, the gesture of someone who's heard every version of but. "Ma'am," he said, "we'll need to see the property as reported. Standard procedure." Behind her, Daniel appeared, his face pale and unreadable. And for a long moment we all stood there like actors waiting for someone to cue the next line. Inside, the house was immaculate, too immaculate, like a crime scene that had been wiped clean before the detectives arrived. The scent of cinnamon-scented cleaner hung in the air, and the counters gleamed so bright they reflected the inspector's flashlights. It was a house built to impress, but it was a fragile performance. Farley started his walkthrough without ceremony, opening cabinets, scanning outlets, tracing wiring with the quiet precision of someone who's learned that danger hides in details. When he saw the electrical box, he frowned, pulled out his pen, and jotted something down. "Who did your wiring, sir?" he asked Daniel, who hesitated just long enough to make the truth obvious. We did some updates ourselves. I'm a contractor, he said weakly. Farley nodded, already knowing the answer. License current? Daniel's silence was the only reply. They moved toward the attic hatch. I could feel Erica's tension vibrating in the air. Her voice rose an octave as she spoke, still trying to sound in control. Oh, that old thing? It's mostly storage. We've been meaning to clear it out. Farley ignored her and pointed upward. We'll take a look. Daniel fetched the ladder, but I stepped forward, took hold of it myself, and set it in place. My hands didn't shake. When Farley climbed up, the cold met him halfway. He ducked his head through the hatch, swept the flashlight beam around, and the silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Then came his voice, flat and unmistakable. No insulation, no heat, no venting. You've got a live bulb with scorched wiring. No smoke alarm. One exit sealed. Someone's been using this space recently. Lopez climbed halfway up to take photos. The burned socket, the frost on the boards, the metal latch that locked from the outside. She asked for a temperature reading, pointed the infrared device toward the rafters, and recorded the result. 39 degrees, she said quietly. Farley nodded and came down, his face expressionless, but his movements brisk. This space is unsafe for occupancy, he said. It's also a code violation to block an egress hatch. That's a serious one. Erica tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. It's not like that. He wanted privacy, she stammered. Farley didn't even glance at her. He was already walking toward the back hall, noting missing detectors, pointing at overloaded outlets, scribbling. Lopez followed, her camera flashing in small bursts that made Erica flinch each time. I stayed near the stairwell, silent, my breath steady, watching years of quiet humiliation transform into documentation. In the driveway, 2 sleek cars pulled up, the investors, early for a follow-up meeting, dressed in cashmere and polite curiosity. They froze at the sight of the county insignia, and I could almost see the calculations spinning behind their eyes. They lingered just long enough to absorb the embarrassment, before one of them discreetly filmed the scene on his phone. Erica noticed and turned a shade of gray that no polite smile could disguise. Farley moved through the house like a surgeon, calm and clinical. He found the makeshift office in the den, extension cords snaking across the floor, space heaters plugged into cheap adapters, printer cables tangled into one long fuse waiting to happen. Unlicensed business activity, electrical overloading, improper ventilation, he recited, each phrase another nail in the coffin of their carefully curated life. Erica sat down heavily on the sofa, her perfect posture collapsing for the first time in my memory. Daniel stood by the window, rubbing the back of his neck like a teenager caught cheating on an exam. When we reached the garage, the smell of gasoline and solvent was thick enough to sting the nose. Farley crouched near the water heater, frowned, and tapped the vent pipe. Combustibles stored less than 3 feet from ignition source, he said. Improper installation. This could have gone bad fast. Lopez peeled off another red sticker, immediate correction required, and pressed it firmly to the cabinet door. Erica whispered something under her breath about reputation, and I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. She was worried about gossip when she'd built her comfort on kindling. By the time they were done, the kitchen table was covered in forms, violation notices, citations, fines. The total, even at a glance, would sting. But it wasn't about money. It was about exposure. Their secret, the attic, the neglect, the performance, was now a matter of public record. Farley explained, in that unhurried tone of bureaucratic authority, what would happen next. Temporary suspension of occupancy in upper areas, mandatory rewiring by a licensed contractor, Smoke and CO detectors required on every level. Inspection follow-up in 30 days. Then he turned to Daniel, his gaze steady. For the record, who sealed the attic hatch? Daniel hesitated. We thought it was unsafe for the kids. Farley didn't react. He simply wrote something down and said, Understood. The report will reflect the facts. Erica tried to protest about the tone of the investigation, saying it was humiliating to have red tags on their property, that it was unfair for guests to see. Farley looked at her for a long second, then replied, Ma'am, fairness doesn't enter the equation until safety does. That shut her up more effectively than shouting could have. When they left, Lopez pressed one final sticker across the attic hatch, a thin red strip like a wound dressed in plastic, sealing it until the next inspection. Farley paused by the door, looked at me briefly, and said, If you need to file a welfare report, the forms are at the county office. You've done what you needed to. His tone wasn't kind, but it wasn't cold either. It was the kind of voice that tells you the world still has rules, and sometimes they work. After they drove off, silence returned. Not the silence of peace, but the hollow quiet after a storm, when everything still trembles a little. Daniel tried to speak first, words tumbling out, half panicked, half defensive. Dad, you didn't have to. We could have handled this internally. You've embarrassed us. You've made it public. I looked at him, not angry, just steady. You locked me in a room with one exit, I said. I made it public so you couldn't hide it anymore. He opened his mouth again, then shut it. There are some truths that don't require repetition. Erica moved mechanically around the kitchen, wiping surfaces that were already clean, her movements sharp and pointless. Then she started calling people, her sister, a lawyer, someone from Daniel's office, spinning a story where she was the misunderstood one, the victim of an overzealous bureaucracy. It didn't matter. The red sticker spoke louder than she ever could. That evening, while they argued in low voices behind the closed study door, I sat at the dining table, spreading out the inspection papers like blueprints. I took photos of each page, emailed them to myself, and added notes from memory. The missing bolts on the deck railing, the sealed back door that required a key from the inside, the lack of venting around the heater closet. Old instincts kicked in. Neat handwriting, numbered points, references to code sections. It wasn't revenge. It was accuracy. I recorded a short voice memo, summarizing the timeline. When they moved me upstairs, how long I was locked in, what I heard during the party. My voice sounded calm, almost detached, like a man reading from a manual. Around midnight, I received the first ripples of consequence. A message from the bank. The business line of credit review was postponed, pending further compliance clarification. An email from their insurance provider followed, a polite request for details about the inspection incident, and later a notification from Daniel's investor group chat. Someone had shared a video of the inspectors, the red tags, the county vehicle in the driveway. In a small town, scandal moves faster than electricity. The next morning, the silence in the house was different, thicker, heavier. Erica didn't come downstairs until late, wearing the kind of careful expression people practice in mirrors before court dates. Daniel avoided looking at me. When the doorbell rang, none of them moved. It was a courier delivering the official citation packet, signed, sealed, stamped. The sound of that envelope hitting the table was louder than any argument we could have had. In the afternoon, I walked to the county office myself, not to stir the pot, but to see the process through. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with readers hanging from her neck, handed me a copy of the property's permit file. 3 incomplete permits, 2 expired, 1 pending review. No record of attic renovation, no fire inspection in over a decade. She shook her head softly. "You're lucky you called when you did," she said. "We've seen tragedies from less." I thanked her, not because I felt lucky, but because I finally felt visible. When I returned, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by open laptops, bills, and legal pads. He looked up, defeated but not defiant. "Tell me what to do," he said quietly, "step by step." It was the first honest sentence he'd spoken to me in years. I told him, "Install detectors on every level tonight. Call a licensed electrician tomorrow. Remove the double-key locks. Shut down the home office until clearance. No anger, no lectures, just procedure." He wrote it all down like instructions for survival. By evening, contractors had come and gone. The smell of solder and new wiring filled the air. The attic, now sealed and tagged, was off limits. For the first time, I saw Daniel actually working, not for profit, but for correction. Erica paced with her phone pressed to her ear, her voice small and uncertain. The children kept to their rooms whispering. And somewhere between the noise of drills and the silence of shame, I felt something uncoil inside me. Not satisfaction, not vengeance, but the clean, cold stillness of completion. When night finally fell, I sat by the window, looking out at the yard where the maple tree stood bare against the street light. I thought of Margaret, of how she would have handled this, and I knew she wouldn't have yelled either. She would have done exactly what I'd done, drawn the line, quietly but permanently. On the table beside me lay a stack of papers, inspection reports, photographs, permits, and at the top, my own note from that morning. "You didn't destroy their home. You reminded them it could burn." I folded the note, slipped it into my pocket, and turned off the lamp. The house behind me hummed with the sound of repairmen still at work. Drills, footsteps, murmured apologies. It was the sound of order being rebuilt from rot. And in that steady rhythm, somewhere between the whir of tools and the sigh of winter wind, I realized I was no longer the old man they'd hidden away. I was something else now, the keeper of consequence, the quiet force that had finally made the house safe, even if it had to break before it could be called home again. It was 3 days after the inspection when the real breaking point came, though by then the house already felt like a waiting room for something inevitable. The smell of new wiring still hung in the air, mingling with the faint acrid trace of burned dust that never quite left the attic. The contractors had gone, the stickers remained, and silence had taken root in every room, thick and sentient, as if the walls themselves were listening. Daniel moved through the house like a man trying not to wake a sleeping animal. Erica barely spoke. Every sound, the clink of dishes, the hum of the heater, echoed with the memory of what they'd done. And me, I sat by the window each morning with my coffee growing cold, feeling the strange calm that comes when you've stopped expecting apology and started expecting nothing. On the 4th morning, the letter arrived. It was from the insurance company, a short, bloodless document that said coverage would be suspended pending a full compliance audit due to material risk and negligent maintenance. I placed it on the kitchen table beside Daniel's untouched breakfast. He stared at it for a long time, rubbing his forehead. "They're pulling our coverage?" he asked, though he'd already read the words. "For now," I said. "You can appeal once everything passes inspection." He nodded mechanically, the movement of someone processing not just a sentence, but the echo of every decision that led there. Erica appeared in the doorway, her hair still perfect, her eyes rimmed red. And for the first time, I saw not anger in her face, but something closer to panic, the naked fear of losing control, She whispered that they'd have to postpone the investor meeting indefinitely, that rumors were already spreading. I could have told her that reputations, like houses, collapse faster than they're built, but I kept quiet. That afternoon, a county officer arrived to follow up, not Farley this time. A younger man named Barnes, who spoke gently but carried a clipboard heavy enough to matter. He walked the perimeter, checked the attic seal, confirmed the new detectors, and took photographs. Erica tried to charm him with coffee and conversation, but his politeness had the weight of indifference. "You'll receive the summary reports in 5 to 7 business days," he said, his tone final. When he left, the wind caught the door and slammed it shut behind him, the kind of small accident that feels symbolic, even if it isn't. Daniel muttered something about everything spiraling out of control, about how one phone call had undone his entire life's work. I turned from the window and looked at him fully for the first time in days. "It wasn't the call that did this," I said. "It was the attic." He stared at me, confusion flickering into guilt, guilt into anger. "You think you're some kind of hero, Dad? You embarrassed us. You ruined my business. You made a scene when all we wanted was peace." His voice cracked on that last word, as if peace had become too fragile a thing to hold. I let him speak, because there was no use interrupting a man arguing with the truth. "You wanted peace," I said quietly. "What you really wanted was quiet. There's a difference." He started to reply, but his voice faltered again. For a moment, I saw the boy he used to be, the boy who used to bring me nails while I built his treehouse, asking if it was safe to climb higher. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped asking. Evening fell early that day, heavy clouds smothering what little light there was. Erica retreated to their room. Daniel poured himself a drink and sat at the counter, staring at nothing. I watched the snow begin to drift outside, the season's first, and realized that for the first time in years, I felt no tension at the sound of my own breathing. Everything had reached its limit. The pressure could go no higher, and when the doorbell rang just past 6, the sound was so sudden it made all of us freeze. Daniel went to the door, opened it, and stood still. It was Farley again, coat dusted with snow, carrying a clipboard and a small envelope. "Just a follow-up," he said. "Some paperwork was finalized earlier than expected." Erica appeared behind Daniel, asking if there was a problem. Farley handed her the envelope. "No problem, ma'am, just confirmation." Then he looked at me. "Mr. Delaney, could you step outside with me for a moment?" The cold hit hard, but it was clean, honest cold, the kind that clarifies rather than punishes. We stood by his vehicle while he signed a form on the hood. "Just thought you'd want to know," he said. "Your report, the one you made, triggered a secondary review. The house passes temporary safety now, but the record stands. It's on file. They can't hide it or erase it. That means something." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "You did the right thing," he added after a pause. "Most people don't." And with that, he was gone, taillights bleeding into the dark like embers. When I went back inside, the envelope lay open on the table. Erica had read it already. Her hands trembled as she held the paper. It was a formal notice from the county confirming the violations and fines. Not a guess, not a rumor, but an official declaration of negligence, signed and sealed. For a woman who lived by appearances, it might as well have been a death sentence. She looked at me across the room, her voice barely a whisper. "You've destroyed us," she said. "You've made us look like monsters." I met her gaze evenly. "You did that when you locked the door." Her face crumpled then. Not theatrically, not for effect, but in a way that was almost human. She left the room without another word. Daniel sat heavily, his head in his hands. "What happens now?" he asked. "You fix what's broken," I said. "Not the walls. You." He didn't answer. The clock on the wall ticked, each second steady as a metronome. For the first time, the rhythm comforted me. Later that night, after they'd gone to bed, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the railings, the door frames, the bones of the structure that had both held and betrayed me. The attic hatch glowed faintly with the red seal still across it. I reached out, traced the line of the sticker with my finger, and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not sorrow, but a quiet finality. It wasn't my prison anymore. It was evidence, proof that silence had consequences. I went to my room, sat at the desk, and wrote my last entry in the notebook. Not a confession, not a lament, but a decision. "I will leave tomorrow," I wrote. Not in bitterness, but in clarity. They built a house out of my patience, and I mistook it for love. Now I build something else. Distance. I closed the notebook and placed it in my bag along with the inspection copies, the photographs, the letter from the insurance company. I didn't take much else, just my wallet, my coat, and the photograph of Margaret that had hung by my bedside since she died. At dawn, before the rest of the house stirred, I stepped outside. Snow had fallen overnight, softening the hard edges of everything. The driveway was a blank page, my footprints the first words. I walked to the end of the street, where the mailboxes stood under the brittle maple tree. I looked back once. The house was still, the attic dark, the red seal catching a glint of morning light. For a brief moment I thought of turning back, of forgiving what couldn't be undone. But the thought passed like breath in the cold. Some things you don't return to. I called a cab from my phone, gave the driver the address of the assisted living center on the edge of town, the one I'd visited months ago, just to see what it was like. They had a woodworking room, a small library, people who talked without shouting, who listened without pretending. As the car pulled away, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared behind a bend. I didn't feel victory. I felt release. When we reached the center, the air smelled of coffee and pine disinfectant. The receptionist smiled, asked if I'd come to visit someone. "Myself," I said. "I'm moving in." She handed me a form, and I filled it out in careful, measured handwriting. The same way I used to draft blueprints, knowing that precision can outlast emotion. By evening, my new room was warm, simple, alive with the small sounds of community. Through the window, I could see lights twinkling across the distant neighborhood where my old house stood, hidden behind snow and shame. I thought of Daniel and Erica sitting in their spotless kitchen, surrounded by the ruins of appearance, and I felt neither pity nor resentment, just a quiet truth. I had spent years being the structure that held them up. Now I had finally stepped outside, and the house would have to stand, or fall, on its own. I placed Margaret's photograph on the desk, turned off the light, and let the stillness settle. The storm had already passed. What remained was peace, not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the earned peace of a man who had chosen justice over comfort. For the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of walls. Winter held on longer that year, as if the cold itself refused to move on until everything inside me had thawed. Life at the center settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar, the kind of gentle order that doesn't demand anything from you except presence. In the mornings, I walked the hall lined with windows that overlooked the frozen pond, and in the afternoons I sat in the woodworking room with a cup of weak coffee, sanding down scraps of pine until the grain gleamed smooth under my fingers. The sound of sandpaper, the scent of sawdust, they steadied me in ways that words never could. No one here asked about my past. They only asked if I wanted to join for cards or dinner, and that small mercy of anonymity became its own form of healing. The first letter came 2 weeks after I moved in. It was from Daniel, handwritten in the nervous, uneven scrawl of someone unused to ink and confession. He wrote that the house had passed reinspection, that the fines were paid, that he and Erica had started therapy to work through communication issues, a phrase so clinical it almost made me laugh. Near the end of the letter, though, his tone shifted. He said he'd watched the attic being rewired, seen the burned socket replaced, and realized that it wasn't just the wiring that had failed. It was the connection between us. He didn't ask forgiveness. He said he wouldn't dare. He only wrote, "I understand now what it means when you said the attic wasn't just unsafe. It was a reflection." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Margaret's photo. I didn't write back right away. Some things need silence to cure properly, like wood after a long winter. Weeks passed, marked not by drama, but by small rituals. The nurse who always hummed while checking blood pressure, the old veterans arguing about baseball scores in the TV room, the smell of soup drifting through the halls at noon. It was the first peace I'd known in decades, the kind that isn't fragile because it owes nothing to anyone. On Sundays, I took the bus to the library, and once, when the weather softened, I found myself walking past my old neighborhood. From the corner of the street, I saw the house. The paint had been touched up, the red sticker gone, the lights glowing warm behind drawn curtains. It looked exactly the same, and yet completely changed, smaller, quieter, humbled somehow. For a moment I almost crossed the street, but then a curtain moved in an upstairs window, and I caught a glimpse of Daniel holding his son, pointing at something outside, maybe explaining, maybe remembering. That was enough. I turned back toward the bus stop. At the center, they asked if I would teach a weekly safety workshop for the residents. Basic home maintenance, fire prevention, small repairs. I agreed, not out of pride, but because it felt right to use what I knew for people who still listened. The first class, a dozen faces stared at me with polite attention, and I began by writing 3 words on the whiteboard. Respect the structure. I told them it wasn't just about houses. It was about the invisible frameworks that keep a life upright. Decency, vigilance, truth. I said you don't wait for the fire to learn the exits. They nodded, and in that moment I realized I wasn't talking to them alone. I was talking to the version of myself who once believed that love could survive without boundaries. Spring came quietly, the snow receding from the grass in slow, uncertain streaks. One morning, a package arrived at the front desk. No return address, just my name in Daniel's handwriting. Inside was a small wooden box, sanded smooth and varnished to a soft sheen. On the lid, carved with shaky hands, were 3 words. For Dad, safe now. Inside lay a single brass latch, the kind used for attic doors, polished clean and detached from any frame. It was both apology and closure, wordless and complete. I held it for a long time, feeling the weight of metal, the warmth of forgiveness that didn't demand reconciliation. I placed it on the windowsill where sunlight could touch it, a quiet memorial to everything that had locked and everything that had finally opened. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit in the common room by the fire with the other residents. We talk about nothing important, weather, sports, the small aches of age, and yet there's a kind of sacredness in that ordinariness. I've learned that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives as a whisper of warmth on a cold night, reminding you that you are still here, still breathing, still your own. I no longer think about the attic, except when I hear the wind slip through the vents. Then I smile, because I know it's just air, moving freely where it once couldn't. The last time Daniel visited, he brought his son with him. The boy stood shyly by the doorway, holding a bouquet of paper flowers he'd made at school. He handed them to me without a word, and I thanked him. Daniel didn't say much either. He just looked around the room, at the tools, the books, the open windows. "It's nice here," he said finally. "Peaceful." I nodded. "It's built that way." When they left, he shook my hand, not as a son seeking approval, but as a man acknowledging another man's line drawn in the sand. And for the first time since all of it began, I felt something close to pride. Not in him exactly, but in the quiet proof that the world can correct itself if you stop protecting its mistakes. Now, when I wake in the mornings, I don't listen for footsteps overhead or doors closing. I listen for the hum of the heater, the creak of the floorboards, the small, trustworthy sounds of a place that doesn't lie. The attic of my mind is empty now, cleared, aired, light coming in from all sides. Sometimes I think of the fire marshal's red sticker, how it glowed like a wound on the ceiling of that house, and I realize it wasn't a mark of shame. It was a mark of truth, a boundary written in color. The house failed every code, but I didn't, and that, I suppose, is the quiet ending no one sees coming. Not revenge, not reconciliation, just equilibrium. A man once locked away so he wouldn't be seen becomes in the end the witness to his own freedom. The guests are gone, the attic is safe, and I finally am too.